Minister Hajdu, thanks for taking some time for us here.
Oh, happy to be here. Thanks very much.
So first off, the fires in BC and the Northwest Territories, what sort of supports is the government offering for affected First Nations communities?
Well, we're working really closely, first of all, with the provinces and territory to make sure that there isn't any people left behind. And so the first thing I would say is that Indigenous Services Canada has partnerships, and depending on the province or territory, it might look different. For example, in BC, most of the emergency management is handled directly through the First Nations Emergency Services, which is funded by the federal government, but then provides a First Nations led approach to emergency management. We're supporting evacuees, we're supporting communities. Of course, we're supporting with additional costs, we're supporting with cash flow, and we're also supporting with the needs that many evacuees have. And I'm sure you've been hearing those stories of people having to leave very quickly, not having their medication, perhaps not having their essential items like hearing aids and glasses and all kinds of different things, including the ongoing mental health support for people that are living in such precarious situations.
Well, moving to some budgetary issues, the Treasury Board has mandated each minister find $15 billion in savings. How do you plan to find these savings in your department?
Yeah, so it's $15 billion overall. Each department is responsible for contributing to a reduction in spending to that amount. And so I've had ongoing conversations with the Deputy Minister who is responsible for the operations of Indigenous Services Canada. And my focus is on looking for those efficiencies that I know we can find. There are many different ways that we can be more efficient, that we were very innovative in COVID and coming up with fast and effective systems to do things that we had never done before. And I'm certain we can do that again through this lens. So, for example, there are programs that have a high need for a lot of eyes. I'm thinking of Jordan's Principle, for example, and that Jordan's Principle delays have been in the news lately. So looking at ways that we can be more efficient in processing claims, whether it's in batches or whether it's in a more proactive way that gets money out the door and does verification checks later. That's just one example that comes to the top of my mind, but certainly we're looking at every aspect of operating the department through the lens of creating those efficiencies and ensuring that we are really getting the biggest bang for our buck, if you could say that, in terms of getting services delivered to communities.
Should people expect there to be some cutbacks to program services?
I've been really clear that my direction to the deputy is that this cannot affect services for First Nations, and that obviously First Nations have a number. It's often when you think about the kinds of functionings that municipalities are obligated to provide their people, it's no different in First Nations. There are health considerations, there are education considerations, and infrastructure considerations, and services cannot be affected for First Nations people. We have to find these savings through efficiencies at the department level, so that people can feel confident that they'll have what they need to continue to deliver services for their members.
One, of course, long-standing issue has been housing on First Nations, which is now viewed as a crisis everywhere. But, it was one of the major topics at the retreat. What was discussed to address First Nations housing needs?
We've invested billions of dollars into First Nations housing, and of course, there's still a gap. But for every one house that the previous Conservatives built, we've repaired or built 9 more. So you can see the speed that we're operating at in terms of First Nations housing. And what I would say is that there's an opportunity to accelerate that work in every space, whether we're talking about Indigenous housing on reserve or whether we're talking about the new $4 billion fund for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. There are some exciting things happening in terms of accelerating the ability for First Nations to have autonomy about how those houses are built and what kind of structure they take. And so I'm excited about the conversations coming up. I know that it's a priority, not just for every Canadian across this country, but it's a priority for our government to make sure that we can actually move more quickly with our partners, because quite frankly, we need our partners. We need to be, all of us at every level of government, and that includes First Nations level government, thinking about how we do things more quickly so that people have a safe roof over their heads.
Minister Hajdu, we'll have to leave it there, but appreciate you taking some time for us.
Appreciate it, Dennis. Thank you.